At my engagement party, my parents mocked me in front of everyone, saying, "You're marrying up because you were always the family disappointment." But when my fiancé gave them a copy of the prenup with my net worth listed first, I, a 28-year-old female, just had the most humiliating experience of my life at my engagement party. My parents, who've never really supported me, publicly mocked me in front of all my friends and family, saying I was marrying up because I was always the family disappointment. I was beyond hurt, but my fiancé Luke 31M did something that completely changed the entire tone of the night. Without a word, he handed my parents a copy of our prenup, but what they didn't expect was that my net worth was listed first, not his. Suddenly, they went silent. The tables turned, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was the one being looked down on. My name is Elena Wright. I grew up in a small, quiet town in Ohio, where everybody knew everybody else's business. My family was well known, and that came with its own set of expectations. My parents, Sylvia and Henry, were pillars of the community. My brother, Mason, and my sister, Tara, were everything my parents had hoped for. They were the picture-perfect children, intelligent, successful, and compliant to the expectations that came with being the Wrights. Then there was me. The wild card. The disappointment. From the moment I could talk, my parents made it clear that I wasn't the daughter they had dreamed of. I wasn't as smart as Mason, and I didn't have the same polished, poised nature that Tara did. I didn't follow their rules. I didn't try to fit into the boxes they had so neatly constructed for us. And for that, I felt like I was always in their shadow, always failing. But, as the years went by, I managed to carve out my own path. I left for the city, away from the heavy expectations, and started my own life. I worked hard, built a career in marketing, and found success in ways I wasn't sure I'd ever achieve when I was younger. I thought my life was finally my own. Then, Luke came along. We met through work, and he was different. He was patient, kind, and grounded. He wasn't threatened by my independence, in fact, he respected it. Luke was everything I had hoped for in a partner, and he loved me not because of what I could bring to the table, but for who I was. It was a whirlwind. A few months after we met, we got engaged. I felt nervous about telling my family, especially because my parents were never particularly supportive of my choices. But Luke convinced me that this was the right thing to do. We decided to throw an engagement party and invite all of our friends and family to celebrate. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, this would be a turning point. But of course, I didn't expect what would actually happen. The night of the engagement party was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. The venue was gorgeous, one of those high-end places downtown that made you feel like you were in a movie. The guests were a mix of my friends, Luke's colleagues from his law firm, and family. I could already feel the weight of my parents' presence the moment they walked in. My mom was dressed to impress, as always, with her perfectly styled hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. My dad was more subtle but just as imposing, always standing just a little too straight, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room as if he was judging everything. I tried to ignore the way they made me feel, like I was somehow beneath them. I had grown used to it over the years. But still, there was a tiny, hopeful part of me that wished this time would be different. This time, maybe they would be happy for me. As the night wore on, things seemed to be going okay. I introduced Luke to some of my old friends, and he was as charming as ever. People were congratulating us, and I could feel the warmth of the celebration surrounding us. But then, the moment came when my dad raised his glass for a toast. "Well," he said, his voice carrying over the chatter of the room, "isn't this just wonderful? My little Elena, getting married. Who would have thought, right?" The guests fell silent, and I could feel the weight of his words. I looked at my mom, who was already smiling her tight smile, probably waiting for my dad to continue. "You're marrying up, I suppose," my dad went on, his voice dripping with condescension. "After all, you've always been the family disappointment. It's nice to see that you finally managed to find someone who could clean up your mess." My breath caught in my throat. The word stung like a slap to the face, and for a moment, I thought I might crumble right then and there. I could see Luke's hand tighten on his glass, but he didn't say anything. He was trying to remain composed, but I knew how much that hurt him, too. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and my cheeks burned with embarrassment. I tried to speak, but I could feel the lump in my throat. "Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it," I finally managed to say, my voice shaky. "But I don't think I need anyone to clean up my mess." Before my dad could respond, my mom chimed in, her voice sharp but oddly satisfied. "We've always tried to help you, Elena. But you just never seem to want to listen. It's a relief to see you're finally getting somewhere, even if it's only through someone else's wealth." I felt tears threatening to spill, but I fought them back. It was always like this. No matter how hard I worked or how far I came, I was never good enough in their eyes. I had always been the mistake, the one who didn't measure up. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't about to let them break me again. That's when Luke did something unexpected. He stood up slowly, walking over to where my parents were standing, and handed them a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of our prenup, the one we had both signed a few weeks ago. My father took it from him, clearly confused, and unfolded the document. I watched as his eyes moved across the paper, skimming the sections of the prenup, and then stopped at the part where our net worth was listed. I had no idea what Luke had done, but when my father's face paled, I realized what was happening. Luke had ensured that my net worth was listed first. Not his. I could see the shock on my father's face as he read the figures. I watched him try to process the information, his mouth opening and closing as if he didn't know how to react. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. For once, I wasn't the one who had to apologize or feel ashamed. For once, I wasn't the one in the spotlight of judgment. I didn't know," my father said, his voice quieter now, barely above a whisper. You're worth more than I thought." I met his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yes, I am. And I didn't need your approval to get here. I built this life on my own. I didn't marry Luke because I need his money or his status. I'm marrying him because I love him." Luke stood beside me, a silent support. I could feel his hand on my back, a reassuring pressure that told me I wasn't alone. "And in case you didn't realize, I'm not a disappointment anymore," I added, my voice steady now. "Not to myself, and certainly not to anyone else." For a moment, the room was completely silent. No one knew what to say, and even my parents seemed stunned into silence. It was the first time I had ever stood up to them so openly, and though it had been painful, I knew it was necessary. After a long, heavy pause, my mother looked away, unable to meet my eyes. My father folded the prenup back up and handed it back to Luke. Without another word, they turned and left the room. The rest of the evening was a blur. I don't remember much about the people who stayed or the toasts that were made. I couldn't shake the feeling of triumph mixed with sorrow. Triumph, because for the first time I had shown my parents that I wasn't the failure they always thought I was. Sorrow, because I knew they still didn't fully understand me. I wasn't sure they ever would. But Luke and I stayed for a while longer, chatting with a few friends who had stayed behind. He was calm, steady, and completely unfazed by the chaos that had just unfolded. "You were amazing tonight," he said, his voice warm. "You stood up for yourself. I'm proud of you." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't need anyone's validation, not even my parents'. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but replay everything that had just happened in my mind. The sting of my father's words still burned deep in my chest, but the feeling of standing up for myself, of not letting their cruel remarks get the best of me, felt oddly empowering. Luke kept close to me, offering quiet words of encouragement whenever he could sense my thoughts drifting back to the chaos. But even his presence couldn't fully shake the discomfort I felt. I was raised to be compliant, to make everyone around me comfortable, especially my parents. And now, I had shattered that long-standing expectation in front of an entire room of people. The silence that followed my parents' departure hung heavy in the air. Guests began to filter back into conversations, but many glanced over at me with looks that mixed sympathy and awe. Some whispered amongst themselves, probably trying to process what had just unfolded. "I didn't expect that," Luke said softly as we made our way to the far side of the room, away from the small cluster of onlookers. He leaned against the wall, his eyes watching me intently. "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath, trying to ground myself. "I'm not sure." The adrenaline from standing up to my parents was still coursing through me, but beneath it all, there was a sense of unease. I wasn't sure if it was the fact that they hadn't apologized or the fact that I had finally drawn a line between who I was and who they wanted me to be. I had spent so long in their shadow that breaking free didn't feel as natural as it should have. Luke seemed to sense the inner conflict swirling inside me. "You did the right thing. Don't second-guess yourself." I trailed off, unsure how to articulate the mix of emotions bubbling inside me. I thought, maybe this time, they'd be different. Maybe they'd be happy for me. But instead, it's just the same old thing. Luke nodded slowly, understanding more than I had expected. "Your parents, they've always expected a certain version of you, haven't they?" I looked up at him, surprised by the insight. "Yes. It's like I'm just supposed to be who they want me to be. I've spent years trying to get their approval, trying to live up to what they think I should be. But now, I feel like I'm finally standing on my own." "You are," he said, his voice firm. "You've always been standing on your own, even if they couldn't see it." I wanted to believe him. Deep down, I knew he was right. But it was hard to shake the feeling that no matter how far I had come, no matter what I had achieved, I would always be their disappointment. As the evening continued, Luke and I tried to salvage what we could of the night. People came over to offer their congratulations, but the tension from earlier still hung in the air. I could tell some of the guests weren't sure what to say or how to act after the scene that had unfolded. It wasn't every day that parents publicly humiliated their own daughter at her engagement party. Despite the undercurrent of awkwardness, there were a few moments of normalcy, when friends shared stories or when Luke's colleagues gave us their best wishes. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something inside me had changed forever. I hadn't anticipated the weight of this moment. For so long, I had been living my life in a way that tried to avoid upsetting my parents, trying to mold myself into their version of success. But now, it felt like a door had opened, one that I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. I had taken the first step in confronting the expectations they had placed on me, but I wasn't sure what would come next. After a while, we decided to leave. The party had lost its luster, and I could see that both Luke and I were exhausted, emotionally and mentally drained from the intensity of the evening. On the way out, I couldn't help but glance toward the door, half expecting my parents to come back and offer some sort of apology. But they never did. They left in silence, and that silence lingered long after they were gone. The drive home was quiet. Luke kept his hand on my knee, offering silent support. I appreciated it, but I was lost in my thoughts, replaying my parents' words, wondering if they truly understood the damage they had done. I knew I would need to talk to them eventually. I had spent years allowing them to dictate my self-worth, and now, for the first time, I had taken control. But what did that mean for my relationship with them moving forward? Could I ever truly break free from their grasp? And if I did, would I be okay with the consequences? "Do you think they'll ever change?" I asked quietly, breaking the silence. Luke turned to look at me, his face soft but serious. "I think they're capable of change, but I think it will take time. They've always known you as the person they wanted you to be, not the person you actually are. That's a hard thing to accept." "I just don't know if I can keep trying to meet their expectations," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's like no matter what I do, it's never enough for them." Luke's grip on my knee tightened, and he leaned closer. "You're enough. You've always been enough." His words were a balm to my battered soul, but they couldn't fully erase the years of rejection I had felt. The sting of those childhood memories, of always being the one who couldn't measure up, was still fresh. But as I looked at Luke, I realized something. I had found someone who saw me, truly saw me, for who I was, and loved me all the same. I wasn't a failure. I wasn't a disappointment. And with Luke by my side, I didn't have to be anyone but myself. When we got home, I sat on the couch, replaying the events of the night again and again. It wasn't just the confrontation with my parents that lingered in my mind, but the realization that I had finally found my voice. After years of allowing my parents' judgments to shape me, I had stood up for myself. But even as I embraced that victory, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what was still to come. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. I knew that. But as long as Luke was with me, I felt like maybe I could face whatever came next. I looked over at him, sitting beside me, and offered a small smile. "Thank you for tonight. For everything." Luke smiled back, his eyes warm. "You don't need to thank me. I'm proud of you. You were incredible." I held his gaze, trying to convince myself that everything was going to be okay. The reality was, I still had a lot to work through. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally standing on my own, and it was both terrifying and liberating at the same time. The next few days were a strange mix of emotions. I found myself caught between the high of standing up to my parents and the realization that things would never be the same between us. The hurtful words they had thrown at me at the engagement party lingered, and no amount of reassurance from Luke could completely take away the sting. As much as I tried to move on and focus on the positive aspects of my life, my engagement, my career, and the bright future I had with Luke, there was a nagging feeling that I needed closure. I couldn't just let what happened with my parents slide. Not after everything they'd said, not after the years of their dismissive attitudes toward me. I knew I had to confront them. But this time, I wasn't going to let them walk all over me. I had already shown them that I wasn't the person they had spent my entire life trying to mold, but I needed something more, something that would make them truly understand the weight of their actions and, perhaps, force them to acknowledge the hurt they had caused. A week after the engagement party, I decided it was time to take action. I called my mom first. The conversation was awkward, as expected. She didn't apologize, of course. Instead, she tried to justify her and my father's behavior, claiming they were just looking out for me and trying to make sure I didn't settle for someone who wasn't a good match. I didn't want to get into another argument about the past. I wasn't interested in defending myself anymore. What I wanted was for her to understand how damaging her words had been, not just that night, but throughout my life. "I don't need you to protect me anymore, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not the little girl who needs you to guide her. I've spent years making my own decisions, and while I appreciate your concern, I'm done living under your shadow." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, but she didn't respond immediately. Finally, she said, "I never meant to hurt you, Elena. But I see now that I have. Maybe I was just scared." "Scared of what?" I asked, feeling a little numb. "Scared of me living my own life? Scared that I wouldn't need you anymore?" "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I guess I've always thought you needed to be more like Mason and Tara, and I didn't know how to let go of that." I closed my eyes for a moment, the anger and hurt that I had carried for so long washing over me again. But instead of responding with more pain, I did the one thing I hadn't been able to do before: I forgave her. "I'm not going to be who you want me to be, Mom. But I'm okay with that now. I built a life for myself, and I'm proud of it." There was another silence, but this one wasn't filled with tension. It felt almost like the first step toward healing, even if it was only a small one. "I guess I'm proud of you too, Elena," she said softly, her voice filled with something I hadn't heard from her in years: sincerity. "I'm sorry for everything." A few days later, I called my father. That conversation didn't go as smoothly. As expected, he didn't offer any kind of apology. In fact, he tried to deflect, telling me that he had only meant the best for me, that he was just telling it like it is. It was a typical response from him, a man who had always believed that his way was the only way. But this time, I didn't let him off the hook. I wasn't going to let him dismiss me again. "Dad," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I know you think you're just being honest with me. But what you said to me at the engagement party wasn't honesty, it was cruelty. You may think it was tough love, but it wasn't. It was damaging, and I've spent my whole life feeling like I wasn't good enough because of things you've said." There was a long pause on the other end. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, more reflective. "I didn't know you felt that way," he muttered. "I thought I was just giving you tough advice, but I see now that I've been pushing you too hard. Maybe I didn't understand how much you were hurting." It wasn't the apology I had hoped for, but it was enough. Enough for me to know that for the first time, he was truly seeing me for who I was, not just the person he wanted me to be. "I'm not going to keep playing this role for you anymore, Dad," I said, my voice unwavering. "I'm done with the idea that I'm somehow less than my siblings. I'm my own person, and I've earned everything I have on my own." The following weekend, Luke and I invited a few of our closest friends over for dinner. I had told him about my conversations with my parents, and though he was supportive, he could tell that I wasn't fully at peace. I was still waiting for something more from my parents, some kind of acknowledgement of the hurt they had caused me. It wasn't until the next week, when I least expected it, that I got the closure I needed. I was at home, scrolling through emails when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, I found my parents standing there, both of them looking a little awkward, but earnest. "We've been thinking," my father started, "and we realized that we'd been wrong. We've treated you badly, and we never really understood how much our words and actions hurt you. We're sorry." I could feel my heart start to race. This wasn't the apology I had imagined, it was even better. It was real. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first time they had truly taken responsibility for their actions. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need to demand an apology. They had come to me on their own. "I appreciate it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's taken a long time, but I'm glad we're finally having this conversation." My mother stepped forward, her face softening. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you, Elena. I know I've made it hard for you, but I see now how strong you are. I was scared of losing you, but I've realized that I don't have to control everything. I just want you to be happy." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. "Thank you." They didn't stay long after that. But for the first time, I felt like they finally saw me for who I really was, not the person they thought I should be. A few weeks later, Luke and I had a small wedding. It wasn't the grand affair I had once imagined, but it was perfect in its own way. We exchanged vows surrounded by the people who truly mattered, friends, family, and a new sense of peace that had finally settled in my heart. After everything that had happened, I could honestly say that I wasn't angry anymore. The revenge I had gotten wasn't about humiliation or cruelty, it was about standing up for myself, about asserting my worth in a way that my parents, for the first time, had to acknowledge. I had spent years trying to live up to their expectations, but in the end, the most powerful thing I could do was simply be myself. And that, in itself, was the sweetest revenge of all.